When the lights go out and the world grows silent, that's when they come alive. The shadows that stretch and twist in the corners of your room, the faint whispers that creep through the still night air, these are not your imagination. They are the monsters that dwell in the spaces we dare not look, the horrors we pretend don't exist. Tonight, we journey into the heart of fear itself, where the unknown lurks just out of sight, waiting to strike. Are you ready to face the nightmares that hunger for your screams? These are not just stories, they are warnings. The rain hit the windshield in rhythmic taps, the lone college student behind the wheel gripping the steering tightly. Nate's mind was a storm of its own. He'd flunked out of school, his part-time job at the diner had gone under, and now an eviction notice lay crumpled in his backseat, his only possessions stuffed in a battered duffel bag. The envelope that had arrived 2 days ago sat on the passenger seat, its edges worn from his anxious handling. A letter from a distant uncle he'd never met, informing him of an inheritance, an old farmhouse, and a sprawling plot of land in the middle of nowhere. Nate had clung to the news like a drowning man to driftwood. A fresh start, a chance to figure things out. The drive stretched on endlessly, the rain turning the gray landscape into a blur of shadows. When he finally arrived at the property, just as the sun was setting, his breath hitched. The farmhouse stood tall and proud against the backdrop of a bruised sky. It was older than he expected, but charming. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, and the windows were filmy with age, but it exuded a strange warmth. For the first time in weeks, Nate felt a flicker of hope. Inside, the house was surprisingly well kept. Dusty, yes, but the furniture was intact, the wood floors sturdy beneath his feet. A fire crackled in the hearth, a detail that made him pause. He hadn't started it. Brushing the thought aside, he chalked it up to the property's caretaker, someone he'd likely never meet. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods, and the bedroom upstairs held a neatly made bed. Everything felt too good to be true. By nightfall, the charm began to fade. Nate noticed the temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible in the air despite the fire he stoked in the hearth. Strange creaks echoed through the house, too deliberate to be settling wood. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as though reaching for him. He dismissed it as exhaustion and turned in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. The bed creaked under him, the sound grating in the oppressive silence. The house groaned with the weight of its age, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Something was moving, breathing, watching. At precisely 3:13 in the morning, Nate woke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was pitch black, but he swore he heard whispers. Faint, indecipherable, but undeniably there. He sat up, straining to hear, but the sound ceased, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air was heavy, suffocating. He could almost feel it pressing against his chest. He lay back down, forcing his eyes shut. Morning would come. It always did. But the mornings brought no respite. Each night, the house became more sinister. The walls seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, the angles of the rooms subtly wrong. Doors he'd left open were closed when he turned back, and the faint whispers grew louder, though they still eluded comprehension. On the third night, Nate noticed handprints on the dusty windows. They were too large to be his own and smeared, as if something had been pressing against the glass, desperate to get in or out. By the fifth night, Nate was unraveling. The farmhouse's charm was gone, replaced by a claustrophobic menace. The whispers followed him now, echoing in his ears even during the day. The air inside the house was stale, thick with a scent of rot. The shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, curling around his feet like living things. He tried leaving, but no matter how far he drove down the dirt road, it always looped back to the farmhouse. It was as if the house refused to let him go. On the seventh night, the house revealed its true nature. Nate awoke to the sound of the walls groaning, the wood twisting and splintering as if alive. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages he couldn't understand. The walls began to pulse, flesh-like, as if the house were breathing, and then the darkness came. It seeped from the corners of the room, a void that swallowed the dim light of his flashlight. Nate tried to run, but the floor buckled beneath him, the wood curling into claw like shapes that snatched at his ankles. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive blackness. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, skeletal, with hollow eyes that burned like embers. Its movements were jerky, inhuman, as it advanced toward him. "You belong to the house now," a voice rasped, though the entity's mouth did not move. Nate struggled, clawed at the floor, but the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the house. The last thing he saw was the entity's twisted grin as it reached out with impossibly long fingers and dragged him into the void. When the sun rose the next morning, the farmhouse was as still as ever. The fire crackled in the hearth, the bed upstairs neatly made, and the letter that had lured Nate there lay on the kitchen table, its edges crisp and clean. Somewhere, in a dimly lit room filled with stacks of old papers and envelopes, a hand penned another letter. The ink glistened wetly as the words formed on the page, "To my dearest heir." The first chill of the evening crept along Ethan's spine as he stepped off his skateboard at the cemetery's gate. The ornate iron arch loomed above him, blackened with age and twisted like skeletal fingers clasping at the sky. It was his first night as the cemetery's groundskeeper and security guard. Only 18, fresh out of high school, Ethan's nerves tingled with the weight of his responsibility. He wanted to prove himself, to show he could handle the quiet, eerie solitude of this place. The cemetery was unlike any other he'd seen. Ancient tombstones leaned at odd angles, the inscriptions worn to whispers by time. A mist coiled low to the ground, clinging to his sneakers like the grasping hands of the dead. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to shake off his unease. He had told himself it was just a job, no different from flipping burgers or stocking shelves. But as the gate clanged shut behind him, the sound echoed with an unsettling finality. He headed toward the small office nestled at the edge of the property, a single bulb casting a feeble glow over its doorway. Inside, the air was stifling and stale, smelling faintly of mildew and something he couldn't place, something metallic, like old blood. A row of security monitors blinked to life as he settled into the creaky chair, the static hum filling the silence. At first, the screens showed nothing unusual. Rows of gravestones stretched into darkness, their shadows long and distorted. The occasional flutter of a bat or rustle of leaves caught his attention, but nothing more. As the hours crawled by, Ethan's confidence grew. "This isn't so bad," he muttered under his breath, though the sound of his own voice felt out of place, almost wrong in the oppressive quiet. But then, just past 11 o'clock, the shadows began to shift. At first, it was subtle. A flicker at the edge of the screen. A shadow that seemed to stretch and move against the grain of the wind. Ethan leaned closer to the monitors, his heartbeat quickening. He told himself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the dark. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Midnight struck, and the faint chime of the office's clock seemed unnaturally loud. Ethan's eyes darted back to the monitors. That's when he saw him. An old man, hunched and gaunt, wearing a tattered groundskeeper's uniform, appeared on the screen. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but the way he moved, deliberate, unnatural, made Ethan's skin crawl. The man walked between the graves, his figure flickering as if caught between two worlds. Ethan's breath hitched. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered, though no answer came. Gathering his courage, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The cold bit at his skin as he walked among the graves, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the mist. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. The tombstones seemed to lean closer, their inscriptions like warnings he couldn't read. He called out, his voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone out here?" The words evaporated into the mist, swallowed by the oppressive darkness, and then he saw it. His skateboard, the one he had leaned against the office wall, was stuck upright in the ground, its nose buried like a gravestone. It stood before an open plot, the freshly dug earth dark and damp. Ethan's heart pounded as he approached, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The grave was empty, a yawning void that seemed to breathe. A sudden force struck him from behind, and he tumbled forward. The air rushed from his lungs as he landed in the grave, his back colliding with something hard and cold. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam casting wild, spinning shadows. He was lying in an open casket. Panic seized him as he scrambled to climb out, but the walls of the grave were slick and unyielding. Above him, the old man's face appeared, pale and sunken, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. The man held a rusted shovel, and a twisted grin spread across his face as he began to toss dirt into the grave. Ethan screamed, the sound raw and primal, but it was drowned out by the thud of earth hitting the casket. The weight pressed down on him, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The old man's laughter echoed above, a chilling sound that reverberated through Ethan's very bones. Darkness closed in, heavy and suffocating. His vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling. And then, Ethan jolted awake, gasping for air. He was in the office, the monitors glowing dimly around him. His heart raced as he looked around, his hands trembling. It was just a dream, a horrible, vivid dream. He grabbed his skateboard and bolted out the door, the cold night air shocking against his skin. He didn't stop until he reached the gate, his breath clouding in the frigid air. As he turned to glance back at the cemetery one last time, he froze. The old man stood beneath the arch, his hat pulled low, his hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. Ethan blinked, and the figure was gone. Without another second's hesitation, he pushed off on his skateboard, the wheels rattling against the pavement as he fled into the night. Behind him, the cemetery stood silent and still, but the oppressive feeling lingered, as if unseen eyes followed his every move. Somewhere in the distance, faint laughter echoed, carried on the wind. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to wrap around you like a damp shroud. Mark Edwards gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, his knuckles white with tension. The divorce papers in his passenger seat felt heavier than they should, like a tombstone for his failed marriage. He had signed them just hours ago, his pen scratching against the paper as if it were carving into his soul. Now he was on the road to nowhere, heading toward the small, unremarkable house he had managed to scrape together after the split. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of black cutting through a landscape of shadows. The only illumination came from his headlights, casting fleeting beams on skeletal trees and the occasional road sign. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Fatigue was setting in, each blink of his eyes growing longer, heavier. He had planned to drive straight through the night, but his body was betraying him. When the neon sign appeared in the distance, it was like a mirage. It flickered erratically, casting weak, pale light that spelled out Moonlit Haven Motel. Beneath the sign, an arrow pointed toward a gravel lot, dotted with a few parked cars that looked as lifeless as the landscape around them. Mark hesitated, but felt his resolve crumbling. The prospect of a bed, no matter how lumpy or questionable, was better than the risk of falling asleep at the wheel. The motel loomed ahead, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The architecture screamed 1980s, with its wood-paneled exterior and gaudy, oversized signage. The windows on the upper floor were dark, save for one where the curtains fluttered faintly, as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. Mark parked near the entrance and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang he couldn't place. He grabbed his overnight bag and walked toward the front desk, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulb above the desk buzzing like an angry wasp. The wallpaper was a sickly yellow, peeling at the corners, and the carpet squelched faintly underfoot as if damp. Behind the counter stood a man who seemed to materialize out of the shadows. He was tall and wiry, his features sharp and predatory. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, catching the light in a way that made Mark's stomach churn. They seemed too bright, too alive, like the eyes of a beast poised to pounce. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, almost guttural. Mark nodded, fumbling for his wallet. The man's lips curled into what might have been a smile, but it felt more like a baring of teeth. "Room 7, the man said, sliding a key across the counter. His fingers lingered on it for a moment too long, nails slightly longer and sharper than they should have been. Up the stairs, end of the hall. Mark mumbled a thank you and took the key, his skin crawling as he brushed against the man's fingers. He hurried to the staircase, the back of his neck prickling, as if he were being watched. The hallway upstairs was dim and smelled faintly of mildew. The carpet was threadbare, revealing patches of warped wood beneath. Room 7's door creaked loudly as he unlocked it. The room was as dated as the rest of the motel, with garish floral wallpaper and a bedspread that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The air was stale, carrying a faint, acrid scent that made his nose wrinkle. He set his bag on the bed and turned on the lamp. The weak light illuminated a small, grimy bathroom and a desk with a cracked mirror above it. As he sat down on the bed, his eyes caught something on the wall by the door, a small, dark stain. He leaned closer and felt his stomach lurch. It was red, a drop of blood, smeared slightly as if someone had tried to wipe it away, but hadn't bothered to finish the job. Mark's pulse quickened. He told himself it was nothing, just a careless guest or a long-forgotten accident. But the unease that had settled over him since he arrived refused to dissipate. He locked the door, double-checking it, and tried to convince himself he was safe. The night deepened, and Mark drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams plagued by indistinct shapes and guttural growls. A sudden, sharp thud jolted him awake. He sat up, heart hammering, and strained to listen. Another thud, followed by a muffled scream, sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up his spine. He stumbled to the window, his hands trembling as he pulled the curtain aside. The parking lot below was bathed in moonlight, empty save for his car and the others that hadn't moved since his arrival. Movement at the edge of the lot caught his eye. A shadow darted past, quick and fluid, too large to be human. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he caught a glimpse of fur and gleaming eyes before it vanished into the darkness. Panic gripped him. He grabbed his bag and unlocked the door, peering into the hallway. It was silent, oppressive. The air felt heavier than before, and a faint growling noise seemed to echo from somewhere below. Mark bolted for the stairs, his footsteps loud in the suffocating silence. As he reached the lobby, the front desk was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the flickering neon sign outside. He pushed through the front door and ran toward his car, but as he fumbled for his keys, he heard a low, guttural snarl that froze him in place. He turned slowly, his breath hitching. Standing at the edge of the lot was the man from the front desk, but he was no longer a man. His body was hunched, his limbs elongated and twisted, fur sprouting from his skin. His eyes, those same predatory eyes, locked onto Mark with a hunger that was unmistakable. Mark ran, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the woods behind the motel. Branches tore at his skin, the moonlight barely guiding his path. The snarls grew louder, closer. He didn't dare look back. When he stumbled into a clearing, the moon emerged fully from behind the clouds, bathing the scene in cold light. Mark's chest heaved as he turned to see the creature stalking toward him, its fangs bared and dripping. It was the man. No, the beast from the front desk. Mark's scream was swallowed by the night as the werewolf lunged, its jaws closing around his throat. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the motel in the distance, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. The moonlit Haven Motel remained, waiting patiently for its next unsuspecting guest. First and foremost, thank you for your continued support on the channel. It is so deeply appreciated, and I greatly enjoy connecting with every one of you. Which creepy story did you enjoy? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more eerie tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. If there are particular stories you want to hear, please let me know. Until next time, my friends.